Hello, good evening, good afternoon to everyone for joining us again on a discussion about bird flu and virology. And I've got Jennifer Smith, PhD, with me. I've spoken to her on a few occasions, brilliant presenter. And it's a great privilege to be able to bring in these experts who can give their viewpoints. That's what science is about. No, you don't always have to agree with them, but certainly, the exploration of the science and trying to understand it is absolutely critical at this phase of the pandemic. There is now a lot of noise about bird flu, but why don't we talk to somebody who actually did the studies around influenza and this kind of influenza pandemic many years ago? And so, without further ado, I bring in Jennifer. Jennifer, can you just introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, Philip. Thanks again for having me back. I've had a lot rolling around in my head on this bird flu situation and trying to get my head around it. I have so many questions, but yeah, I have a PhD in microbiology and molecular cell sciences. My expertise is respiratory viruses, mainly influenza. So most of my career, I've worked with influenza. Mostly in animal models, testing pathogenicity. I've worked with everything from avian influenza viruses to human pandemic viruses in all kinds of animal models, mice, ferrets, poultry, you name a poultry or animals, bird species. I've probably done some work with that. My PhD work was in, excuse me, the ecology of influenza viruses in the live animal markets in Southeast Asia. So yeah, I've done all kinds of work with vaccine development and preclinical testing for both human avian influenza vaccines as well as for poultry avian influenza vaccines.
Wow. So listen, Jennifer, I think one of the things that I'm going to have to start with, I know it's a difficult subject for you, but I think it's important to tackle it right at the front. A lot of people don't even believe that viruses are real. What do you say? I have no idea how to respond to that. It's kind of like a flat earth discussion. What do you say?
Well, personally, I have been vilified and maligned as a virologist by this group of virus deniers, as well as my colleagues who are virologists. Um, first of all, I think it's a distraction. I think it's a huge distraction for what's most important. And secondly, I think it's just the opposite end of the spectrum of the mass psychosis that we experienced during the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good answer. Yeah, see, it's almost as if because there are so many things that were flawed in the pandemic, the point is now, I think it's a reflection of the fact that public trust has fallen so low in science. They don't trust anything at all that's said by a scientist. I think at the moment, scientists are becoming the 2008 bankers. Is that about right?
Well, I knew at some point they would eventually come for the virologists. I knew at some point we would be the ones thrown under the bus.
Yeah, this is a real challenge. And before we go into the influenza stuff, just to touch on a few of the important topics. Now, quite recently, there has been more and more discussion about the concept of a lab leak with regards to SARS-CoV-2. It's finally being fully acknowledged that this is a real possibility. Therefore, people are starting to worry that, even what's happening with bird flu is along a similar kind of line. Any kind of thoughts on that?
Um, Personally, I've never doubted that the virus came from the lab. I've managed a biosafety containment laboratory. I've worked in biosafety containment laboratories with respiratory viruses. After learning about the situation in the Wuhan Institute, I had no doubts that the virus came from the laboratory.
Yeah, yeah. So this is part of what I think people are anxious about is that if there is an acknowledgement that this could happen with SARS-CoV-2, is this what the hype is around with regards to bird flu? But let's not deal with that yet. Let's just deal with some basics. Uh, it- Most people, is bird flu the same as flu, human flu? Are they different?
Right. So, just a way of background, influenza is actually a disease of birds. And so, the wild aquatic birds are considered to be the reservoir for influenza viruses. We know that all subtypes of influenza viruses can be found in wild aquatic birds. And so it's generally accepted that's where they come from. Now, stable lineages of influenza viruses have been established in mammals such as humans. So, we're all familiar with H1 and H3. Those are the stable lineages that have been established in the human population over time. Also, there are stable influenza lineages in horses. We have equine flu, H3 and H7. And then also in swine. So there are several lineages have them established in swine. Other mammals or other animals we've detected influenza in include seals, whales, dolphins, recently, I believe, foxes. They've tested positive for cats and dogs. Dogs, there was an outbreak, I forget how many years ago. Dogs with racing tracks were infected with the equine influenza viruses. So now we have canine flu. So there are a lot of animal species that have been affected, but they all originate from birds. Now, just a little background, I said H5 and N1 and H1N1. So we're all familiar with SARS now and the surface protein, the spike protein. Everyone's heard about spike protein. This is the major antigenic protein that's on the surface of the virus. For influenza, we have two surface proteins. One is called the hemagglutinin. We generally say HA for short. And the second one is neuraminidase, or NA for short. So there are currently 18 known HA subtypes and 11 known NA subtypes for influenza. And these can be found in any combination in the wild populations. So again, when we talk about influenza virus, we generally talk about them in terms of what the HA and NA surface proteins are.
And is that what differentiates which animals or mammals get infected? So do they tend to, let's say, birds get infected by birds, as you'd say, swine get infected by swine, and there isn't that much of an overlap?
So interestingly, swine have an important role in the ecology of influenza because they can be infected with both avian influenza viruses as well as human influenza viruses. So because of the segmented nature of the genome for influenza, viruses can then mix in the pig, so they're considered a mixing vessel, and then new variations of virus can then be transmitted back into the human population. So that's generally how we get new variants into humans. They are along the lines of the same subtypes that we are already seen in humans, such as H1 and H3.
And so when we look at what happened now, say for instance, they're finding bird flu or influenza in cows, where does that fit in?
Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of background with H5N1 viruses. So, where to begin? We generally classify avian viruses by pathogenicity or pathotype. So we have low pathogenic avian influenza viruses and high pathogenic avian influenza viruses. What does this mean? Now, as I said, wild aquatic birds are generally the host reservoir for all influenza viruses. So birds such as ducks and other migratory birds generally do not fall ill or die when infected with influenza viruses. So when we classify by pathotype, what we're generally referring to is disease in domestic poultry, such as chickens. So there are certain subtypes of influenza virus that we consider highly pathogenic. What does this mean? These viruses can not only infect and cause illness in domestic poultry, but they can also cause high mortality. These are generally subtypes H5 and H7 virus. H5N1 is notorious for being pathogenic in chickens, highly pathogenic. And when I was doing testing in the laboratory, we had viruses that could kill 100% of the birds within 24 hours. So they are that lethal in domestic poultry. Now, in general, there's a species barrier, host species barrier, where avian viruses, wholly avian viruses, I should say, generally do not cross the species barrier into humans. Now, this changed in 1997. This was the first time that we actually detected transmission of a wholly avian influenza virus into the human population. So at the time, there were 18 cases of H5N1 in humans, and I believe 6 deaths at the time.
So this can be quite significant in terms of if it does that leap. But as yet, there has never been any significant number of bird to human or swine to human pandemic as such. It has occurred in a few cases, but not in a major pandemic or epidemic way. Is that about right?
That is actually incorrect. So in 2009, we had an H1N1 pandemic. This was actually from swine, believed to have begun in Mexico, from a swine farm in Mexico. Now, the interesting thing about these viruses that came out were they were a mix of both, or actually, I should say, it was a mix of avian, swine, and human genes for this H1N1 virus, which was very unique to to a human transmission. So generally, as I said, these viruses can mix in pigs and then be transmitted back to humans. So this was the first time we saw a triple reassortment virus transmitted to humans. And then again, it went on to become a pandemic.
And so, but it was just not pathogenic. It wasn't significantly pathogenic, was it?
It did not cause high mortality, so it was highly transmissible, but very low mortality.
And so we then had that fear that if it could happen in 1997, and then was 2009 a similar kind of pandemic with, because that was a swine flu 2009?
In terms of,
Was it the same kind of mixing of different viruses and then it became a pandemic in 2009? Or was that one more of a localized epidemic that didn't actually go on to become a major pandemic?
in 2009, it was declared a pandemic. Yes.
It was declared a pandemic as well. So we then had 2 episodes, but again, in both situations, we never really had significant mortality in humans.
So actually, let's go back to H5N1 and give you a little bit more background. So 1997 was the first time we detected wholly avian virus transmitting into the human population. Now, in 2001, there was an event that occurred in, I believe, Hong Kong. We started to see a die-off of what we call ornamental birds. So in the park, I believe it was different species of ducks. Maybe there were peacocks. They were getting infected and dying, which was very unusual because, as I said, H5N1 generally does not cause death in ducks. So with the ducks were dying, it was very concerning. So there was a switch in pathogenicity of these viruses for their host species. Now, I should also mention for the HA is very similar to the spike protein of coronavirus. What do I mean by that? They're both classified as type 1 fusion proteins. So what happens is, we've probably heard about spike protein. There's the S1 portion and the S2 portion. And then this has to be cleaved to trigger fusion and entry into the cell to initiate the infection cycle. So influenza hemagglutinin behaves the same way. It has to be cleaved by a host cell protease in order to trigger fusion and entry into the cell to initiate the cell infection cycle. Now, why is H5 and H7 generally become more pathogenic? Because they have what's called a polybasic amino acids at the cleavage site. So this makes it more easily and more readily cleaved by various host cell proteases. So it can infect more easily into the host cell. So when these viruses started infecting birds, we started testing them and we noticed a shift in my coworker and I found that there was amino acid change in the HA that correlated directly with the pathotype. So in 2002, we again started to see a die-off poultry, and we also saw, curiously, a mysterious pneumonia-like illness in people. So my boss at the time, we had collaborators in Hong Kong. We thought this was it. This was H5 made the leap back into humans, and this was going to trigger the next pandemic. So his collaborators went to the markets. They collected samples from the poultry, and they also went to the hospitals and got samples from the sick persons. Quite interestingly, the samples from the poultry were H5N1. However, the samples from the humans were SARS. So our collaborators in Hong Kong were the first to identify the original SARS virus in humans. So we kind of dodged the bullet there, thinking that H5N1 was not infecting people. Of course, then we had the epidemic of the new SARS virus at the time. But in 2003, these avian viruses kept making the leap into humans. So sporadically, and I believe in Vietnam, we had cases in 2003, 2004. Then we started to see the most troubling or concerning point is person-to-person transmission. So there were one or two clusters they believed were considered to be human-to-human transmission, and some people had no direct contact with sick poultry. So this was very, very troubling. The WHO started to get concerned and wonder if they should start ringing the alarm bells, like, could this really be the pandemic that we were waiting for? So we just kind of monitored the situation. Now, in 2005, the situation started to ramp up, so we had more and more cases, and then the virus were spreading in birds, were spreading into Europe. So people were getting very concerned, going to hospitals, trying to get tested. And these clinical laboratories, they just really don't have the capacity or the technology or actually the understanding to develop a diagnostic test to test for bird flu. So they were testing people, and there were a lot of false positives that were coming out. So this was actually increasing the hype that this could possibly be the next pandemic with avian H5N1. CDC was called in. They tested all the samples, retested all the samples, and they actually turned out to be negative. So crisis averted. So again, going back to the PCR testing, it's very important to have the right technical expertise when you're doing these diagnostic tests to make these decisions. So the WHO backed off. They decided, okay, this is not really a problem. But since 2003, we have seen introduction of avian H5N1 into the human population. And I actually just looked it up yesterday because I was curious now how many cases we're up to. There's actually less than 1,000 cases worldwide, I should say laboratory confirmed cases of avian influenza infection in humans worldwide.
And so it raises the question: is this a storm in a teacup? Why is there so much focus on this bird flu at this time? What's going on?
That's a good question. I don't know. It's very curious to me. We can talk about the situation with the cows if you'd like. Here in the US, avian H5N1 really hasn't been established. Usually those H5N1 viruses only found in Asia. So in the past, historically, we've had two distinct lineages of H5 viruses, the Eurasian lineage and the North American lineage, and neither of the two shall meet. So I'm really curious how we suddenly have a Guangdong, which is a 1996 H5N1-like virus circulating in the United States now. Apparently, after doing some reading, they're suggesting that this virus crossed transatlantic migration of birds, brought this virus into the U.S. The other way it may have entered the U.S. was from the Pacific, across the Bering Strait, down through Canada, and then into the US and Mexico. It's very intriguing to me. I'm not really a ornithologist, so I'm not really sure what bird species could fly across the ocean, especially if they're infected with influenza virus. So I'm just very confused about how we even got this lineage of virus into the US?
Well, I'm going to ask you a question here now. As you know, I'm very COVID focused, and
Yes.
I don't think that COVID is gone, meaning that COVID is still circulating. And as far as I'm concerned, we're going to see a new presentation of disease type. It's not going to be the typical lung kind of pathology that we saw in the first phase of the pandemic. And I expect that actually mortality is going to go through the roof. Now, my concern is that because everybody is discounting SARS-CoV-2 as being a problem now, are they going to then label, if my, well, Geert has said it as well, are they then going to label this as something else? What's the possibility of that?
Label the COVID as something else or label flu as something else?
Well, this is the point, is that if we're talking about a bird flu now, it hasn't spread to that many people. If we suddenly started to see a lot of people starting to get really sick, is that going to then be connected to bird flu rather than potentially COVID?
I mean, I'm not sure I can answer that question. What I found very intriguing when the SARS outbreak began in 2020 was the pathology in the lungs was very similar to what we saw with the pathology from the avian H5N1 in humans. Very, very similar with the destruction of the lungs and the cytokine storm. So, I mean, it's a very similar disease in terms of severe disease anyway. And so, you would have to be very adept at teasing apart which agent is causing that damage.
And that raises the question about the issue about PCR. How effective is that going to be in terms of differentiating it?
Well, I've had my issues with the PCR test, with COVID, with SARS, I should say. And so, again, bringing up this point in Vietnam, when they were testing these people for bird flu, they were coming up positive. So there are a lot of false positives. We have to be very careful when we're using PCR. And I've probably said this multiple times, that you have to use it in conjunction with the clinical symptoms. So, ruling out all other things, you must first rule out all other causes. And when 2020, when it first started, we were trying to rule out influenza and all other respiratory pathogens prior to testing for SARS. Well, that went out the window when SARS testing became widely available. So again, we have to be very careful. What's the saying they say in medicine? If it has, is it a horse or a zebra? What are you really looking at? So let's look at what is more likely first and rule that out before we start panicking and thinking that it's something new and potentially highly deadly.
And so, therefore, based on the trajectory that the governments and the leading health agencies, they are now stocking up and preparing with vaccines. So they are now going to use influenza type vaccines. What are your thoughts about that? Because you were involved in the development of the first influenza vaccine many years ago.
Right. So the laboratory I worked in, we developed the first human H5N1 vaccine for stockpiling for use in humans. So this was a cell-based, reverse genetic derived H5N1 vaccine for use in humans. I believe they stockpiled that. So that was in, I have to reach back in my memory, 2006, maybe 2005, 2006. That went to phase 3 trials. And you should know that this FDA has actually just approved the first human H5N1 vaccine for flu with no clinical trial.
What does that mean when you say no clinical trial? Because we use influenza vaccines all the time. Why would this one be different?
That's a good question. I don't know. This is an inactivated H5N1 vaccine, just approved last month, for use in humans, 6 months of age and older. There's been no testing in humans, so I really don't understand the rationale for that.
And one of the things that I think you point out is that they're using squalene as an adjuvant in this vaccine, just for the purpose of the audience, because a lot of people don't quite understand this concept of adjuvants and vaccines.
Mhm.
What is the purpose of the adjuvant in the vaccine?
So, an adjuvant is something that we add to a vaccine that helps enhance antigenicity. So, what it does is enable the immune system to respond more rapidly in a more robust way so that hopefully you get a longer, more robust memory response to the antigen, whatever the antigen of choice is. So, it just helps enhance antigenicity of whatever it is you're trying to vaccinate against.
And in the past, the primary adjuvant we'd used was aluminium. And then, because of the concerns with aluminium, they've been trying to move to some other adjuvants, one of them being squalene. What is that one here about?
So squalene, or MF59 as it's known, was the only other adjuvant that's approved for use in humans. Now the problem is this is an oil in water emulsion. Squalene's an oil. Um, what it does is helps encapsulate the antigen for slower release. So hopefully you get slower release of antigen over time, so you get a better immune response. Now the issue is it's highly reactive. There are other oil-based adjuvants that are very, very toxic and reactive, so they're not allowed to be used in humans. But squalene is considered a very reactogenic adjuvant. In fact, it's not ideal for use in pediatric populations. And one of the problems is the squalene's been shown to cause a lot of neurological issues. So it's been associated with narcolepsy, especially in the pediatric population. It's been highly associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome, Bell's palsy, convulsions, a lot of anaphylactic reactions with squalene. And then it can also program autoimmune disease.
And so, are you not suggesting that aluminium is better than squalene, is it?
It's not as reactive. um, it's not the ideal, but it's not as reactive.
Interesting. And so, where is the mRNA technology fitting into this whole picture with regards to the vaccines?
So I think Moderna is now working on an mRNA avian influenza vaccine that is poised for release.
And any advantages with that?
I personally don't think that the mRNA platform should be used at all. Certainly not for vaccination.
Wow, that's a big statement. I'm not sure if I want to touch that one anymore, but that's a big statement there. Wow. And so, where we are now, because the we've just been through the pandemic with COVID, and there was, I think, an inappropriate use of vaccines there. I don't think anybody who had previously been infected, I don't think the low risk should have been vaccinated. We knew who the high risk was, and it should have been combined with early treatment. And so, if you had that, you would have minimized who was vaccinated, and
Yes.
therefore you would have had the opportunity to reach herd immunity safely. That was my
Well,
thought
I'm
then.
not sure herd immunity could ever really be reached, to be honest. I think that it's very difficult to attain herd immunity in a static population, no less in a dynamic global population. I just don't think it's possible at all, especially for highly mutable RNA viruses.
I think herd immunity in this sense usually means to me is that I think the big risk for people with SARS-CoV-2 was if they had never been exposed to it. Once you've had exposure, even if you get infected, it tends not to cause severe disease. And so that's what I would mean by herd immunity. Exposure, therefore, yeah, somebody could get infected, don't transmit that much, but they don't get the severe disease. That's the pattern that I'd be looking at. So
Mhm.
when we put that in place and we look at what happened with COVID, could we see similar kind of vaccine mandates coming through if they overplay this bird flu situation?
That would be very troubling, to be honest. Again, we need to go back to risk versus benefit. What is the benefit of a 6-month-old getting a vaccine for avian influenza? I mean, what is the risk? It simply does not make any sense to go ahead and vaccinate an entire population for something. It should be targeted to those at risk. There's been 3 cases now associated with this outbreak in cattle. Here in the US, they're all among people who have direct intimate contact with the cows. We had one case with the avian influenza during the poultry outbreak here. Again, the person was directly involved with culling the birds, so a lot of contact with the animals. So again, risk versus benefit. There is no benefit to vaccinating people who simply aren't going to have the contact or the exposure that those people would. So it's like, we don't need a vaccine for every for every virus on the planet. Ebola, very few people are exposed to Ebola. Would we vaccinate the entire global population? It just does not pan out. It doesn't make any sense.
We're not going to hire you for any vaccine companies. The business model is to vaccinate as many people as possible.
Yeah. Yes.
And then
I'm aware.
I'm, because you have a blend of stuff, your virology, your epidemiology, and your public health. I mean, they wouldn't. Well, this is exactly what happened to you when you were in a different part of the world. You kept on saying stuff like that, and people were getting annoyed.
Yep. Well, the thing is, we need to have integrity, especially with scientific integrity, when you're trying to make recommendations for people. And the problem that I have in public health, and I had this discussion with my colleague who is in infectious disease behaviorist, and I'm like, how are these public health professionals supposed to explain things and educate the public when they themselves don't truly understand any of this themselves? They don't understand virology. They don't understand the interaction. Look, there's a distinct interplay between viruses and the host immune system. And so you have to really have an understanding of both the underlying immune system as well as the virus. And then also these vaccine platforms, their mechanism of action and how they program the immune response is very important. These public health professionals, they just do not have a deep understanding of any of these areas, and then they're supposed to be the ones interfacing with the public and educating them. So that's very problematic, especially when they then take people like me who do have the deep knowledge and expertise and sideline, silence, censor, and fire us.
A lot of people who have just come may not have seen you before. So just to clarify to some of my audience, Jennifer is one of those people who stood up and advocated against much of what happened, and she lost her job for it, so she really stood in the gap. And so one of the big problems we have, as I said, is that the public no longer trusts the science. And so even when you are speaking, the problem is they have now lumped you with all those people who didn't understand the science and were playing the politics and the finance. How do we get out of this?
Right. I mean, look, I've been maligned and vilified by both sides of the spectrum, by the people who totally bought the COVID pandemic hook, line, and sinker, and now by the virus deniers. I've really tried to be a voice of reason. Look, there's very few people who are standing in the middle of the road, and I've really tried to bridge that gap, given my knowledge and understanding of both the research side and the public health side. So, yeah, it's it's very hard being in this position. But that's the thing, when people were attacking me, the virus, I was like, did you read, did you see like what I've said? Like, have you read everything? I published a book with my story and how I came out and blew the whistle on the COVID corruption and the lies there in Hawaii. So it is very difficult. It's very difficult being in this position.
Yeah, it is a real challenge, and I'm trying to think about, it's part of the reason why I think the system is so protective, in that it doesn't want any criticism because it
Mhm.
knows how fickle the public can be, meaning that if the public hears anything that is wrong, they are then going to just discount everything that they're told. Is
Well,
that part of the reason?
the systems will always protect themselves. Look, you have these people in high level positions in these alphabet letter agencies who are trying to protect, they're trying to protect themselves, trying to protect their careers and their legacies. So they're going to do what is necessary to protect that. I don't have an interest. I don't work for a pharma company. I'm not being paid by anybody. I'm not being paid by anybody at all. I have I have no hidden agenda. So, these people who are in high level positions, look, we just saw testimony by Anthony Fauci's right hand man. They deleted emails. They tried to obfuscate by deleting emails, backdoor channels. They are trying to protect their position. So you really have to look at what's the motivation for a person and what they're saying. I have no hidden agenda. I have no motivate, like, no money coming from anybody, from pharma, from CDC. Nobody is paying me to say these things or not say these things.
Yeah, and this is a real issue at the moment. And now, say for instance, with what has happened with the WHO pandemic treaty, I think you'd be in a good position to give some thoughts on that. I'll tell you my position. I noticed that early in the pandemic, when vaccines just came out, before we could assess everything that was going on, they vaccinated the high risk in the first world countries, and then they continued down the line rather than sharing the vaccines. And so I know that fundamentally, these countries will hoard whatever resources they have and not share them at the expense of the rest of the world. So we do need something to try and balance that out. However, I don't think the WHO has done the job of assessing origins. And if you can't do that, why would you be given more power? It's just, it needs to be done, but you need to do your first appraisal and audit as to what you did right and wrong, adjust your strategy, address that, and then get more power. But what are your thoughts?
Look, WHO is a captured agency. It's well known where the funding comes from for WHO. It's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. As somebody who's worked in the field of virology, I've always tried to follow. Look, we're a global community. We have to be aware of what's going on in other countries to be better poised to protect our own at home. So I've always followed PubMed. PubMed is free. It's a surveillance system it's basically monitored and led by volunteers. These people look at potential outbreaks, what's going on in different countries. They try to verify and get pertinent information on things. This is how actually the SARS coronavirus was first noticed, was through PubMed. Now, so I do believe we do need a global agency that can kind of do that similar task. Let's look out for the health of the global people. Now, can it be that WHO? No, it cannot anymore because, as I said, it's captured. We have too much private funding being funneled into the WHO. So this also cannot be a governance agency. It cannot overstep constitutional rights of people in different countries. Each country, each population, each culture has their own traditions. They have their own constitution, and those laws of the land need to be upheld and put first and foremost.
And so we have this situation where we could potentially, as you have acknowledged, have actually a bird flu pandemic. Now, it may not necessarily have high mortality, but in the preparation for something like that, therefore, well, who would you give that responsibility to? It can't be just each individual country on their own.
Well, this whole question of what constitutes a pandemic has been on my mind for several years now. What is the definition? How do we define a pandemic? What does it really mean anymore? It used to be something that is high mortality that spread to multiple countries. So that definition has changed, and now the WHO is playing with that definition as well, and it's basically however they want to define it. So I'm not sure. I think we should go back to the drawing board and try to assess what actually constitutes a pandemic, if we're going to set up another agency to actually monitor and mitigate that risk.
And so you don't think that there is any chance that an agency like the WHO can be reformed to still play that role? Does it have to be literally wiped clean and start again?
Well, I've said this before. We need to uncouple. We need to uncouple public health and health from money. You have to. You simply have to. Yes, there has to be funding. I do understand that healthcare is not cheap, but you have to uncouple the private interests and the private monies from that somehow.
That's a tough one. I mean, I can see how that works in countries that have a bit of a socialist kind of thinking, but that would never work in the US. The US is all about money in healthcare.
Mhm. Yes,
You know, there's doesn't seem to be a way around that. But yes, in other countries there is a chance of uncoupling it. But as you probably know, many of the regulators are funded by industry. And so even that, because the governments don't want to fund them, and so therefore they are funded by industry, and straight away that creates conflicts of interest. All of this plays into a situation where you have a potential pandemic and the countries start buying up stock from the pharmaceutical
Mhm.
industry. It's a club.
It is. It's very troubling when you put profit ahead of people. When the pandemic first began in 2020, distinctly remember the news stations coming out saying that if you know of anyone who's profiting off of this, to turn them in, to let them know. I mean, those people who profited were the ones in charge of the whole thing. So who do you turn to? Who do you report that to? We've seen the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the world occur, in like what 1 or 2 years of the pandemic, which has now made poor people poorer, which puts them at more risk for these diseases. And then the rich just got richer. And so it's very disturbing. And I look, I'm not sure I have the answers. You know, it's just very disturbing to me.
And it raises so many questions, and so little learning seems to have occurred out of the pandemic. It doesn't seem as though, I do find it quite fascinating the amount of people who still don't seem to have any questions out of the pandemic, no matter what their position was. Yep, you thought that, but to at this point not even have questions, to just say, yep, everything was right, everything was perfect, slight errors here and there. How do we move? Because that's not just a few people, that's still
Mhm.
a big percentage of the scientific community. How are we going to bridge that disconnect? Because the public, however, are far more objective, and they have observed this disconnect and they no longer trust the science.
I'm not sure what the question is there.
I'm just
Um,
just whether or not your thought on. I really am at a loss as to how we rebuild this this very delicate thing of trust around the science of certainly health and so on, where we don't have so many big players guiding what is considered to be the science.
right. I mean, like I said, I don't have the answers. I remember when I was working in research, and it was very interesting to me because seeing how the government was funding most of the research. As a scientist, I want to ask a question and let's follow the breadcrumbs and see where it leads. And it could always lead in 10 different paths, like 10 different ways. Oh, if we go down this way, what does that look like? What information does that get us? But the science and the research seem to be shaped from top down. So I remember talking to NIH program officer, and they were like, well, we'd really like to see something along this lines of research. We would really fund something. So they can't tell you what they want you to research, but they tell you what they want you to research. So it's very controlled because that's where the funding comes from, is from the government. So I'm just not really sure how to get back to a more pure scientific inquiry at the basic science level.
Wow. So when we come to tie this all together, based on what you have seen, based on your background in influenza and so on, and what's happening now, do you have any concerns at this point that we are on the brink of another bird flu pandemic that requires preemptive vaccines to the populations?
No. When I was working in the field, my boss, my principal investigator, is a world-renowned influenza virologist. He's basically trained all the virologists in the world who work with influenza. And they tried to scaremonger. He was always like going and scaremongering about this potential for avian influenza to become a pandemic. So he would go every winter to Hong Kong and work with the collaborators there and do surveillance. And, it's definitely something important to monitor. And I guess I should also mention, when we talk about, again, we could bring up case fatality rate and look at the case fatality rate for this avian influenza. I believe they say it's about 50 to 60%. But the thing is, if we did a lot of serosurveys, we would probably find a lot more people who had subclinical or very mild infections. So that would decrease the case fatality rate significantly. So again, it all depends on, are we just finding what we're only looking for and not looking past that? So I'm pretty sure that if you were to test all the workers in the live animal markets in Southeast Asia, you would see that a majority of them probably had already been exposed to avian influenza and probably never even knew it. So just like another virus we just had over the last few years, there are probably a lot of people who had subclinical infections. So the immune system's an amazing thing and can handle a lot. And the more you exercise it, the more adept it gets at handling these types of introductions or exposures. So I'm just not really concerned. I haven't seen any evidence that this should be a problem. Again, we have the host species barrier, which keeps the virus from crossing over and causing much of a problem. The issue becomes risk. So those people who are at more risk, those people who are more directly involved, were the ones who are getting infected. So these are people who probably had a high level exposure. So to bridge the gap of the host species barrier, I think you need a large amount of virus. So a high titer of virus, it's got to get into the right place, down into the lungs. And that kind of exposure is just not going to be typical out in the normal everyday world, in my opinion.
And so you're not going to get rid of your birds?
No. I wasn't going to say anything, but yes, I have my chickens and they are happy and healthy and in their little yard, and there's no mixture of birds. And that's what's very interesting to me about this cow situation is, like, how did avian flu get into cows? And like, why were we even testing for avian flu in cows? And like, what was the impetus for that? And like, the big question is, where was the exposure? I don't know a lot about cattle farming. I know for poultry, domestic poultry like chickens are generally raised in houses. So you have flocks, like maybe 10,000 birds in a house. So they're housed inside. There's not wild aquatic birds flying in and sharing water supplies and, fecal contamination and that sort of thing. So, like, I'm not sure if there are a lot of wild waterfowl in the same area as these cattle farms. I would suspect that there aren't large body of water near like these dairy farms. So so I'm just really intrigued as to how, where, how did this even happen? I just really have a lot of questions about what's the explanation for this introduction into cows.
Wow. Yeah, so that is very reassuring as usual, Jennifer. It's really great to speak to somebody who has such an in-depth knowledge of an area, and really to give us a good explanation of the science around it. So as we close out, any final thoughts, which can be anywhere from the range of virology to epidemiology to public health, what would you say to the audience?
First of all, viruses do exist. They do cause illness. But, as I've said, the response was not proportionate to the threat. So we have to look at let's really assess. We do a lot of risk assessment, in biosafety. So let's assess the risk. If we have risk, then let's look at mitigation measures. So, these people working with the cows, make sure you wash your hands, make sure you disinfect your equipment, make sure you disinfect. Look, I would suggest showering and changing your clothes before going home. I mean, there are very simple things that you can do to mitigate that risk. So there's no need to vaccinate the entire population for this. And there's most certainly not a need to vaccinate 6-month-old babies.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And just before we leave, can you hold up your book?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So, and Jennifer has done Pandemic in Paradise. This was when you worked in Hawaii and you took on the public health and the whole approach to the COVID pandemic. So, if anybody's interested, it's on Amazon, isn't it?
Amazon is directly available from Ballast Books, which is the publisher, and also anywhere books are sold.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you very much again, Jennifer. Just hang with me for the outro. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great evening.